Welcome to Sleep Flow Studio, a place where history drifts gently, where stories unfold in quiet rhythms, and where every word is meant to ease the mind into slower breathing and softer thoughts. Here we explore the calm corners of the past, the forgotten rooms, the quiet archives, the simple moments that settled into time like dust resting on old stone. So settle in, let your shoulders loosen, let your thoughts drift, and allow the soft flow of history to guide you toward rest. This is Sleep Flow Studio, and your quiet journey begins now. Far out in a quiet, sun-faded desert, where the sand moves slower than thoughts drifting before sleep, there once stood a forgotten library. Not a grand library of polished stone or carved pillars, but a low, wandering place made of pale clay and old wooden beams. From a distance, it looked like a cluster of quiet dunes, its shape softened by centuries of wind. Travelers often passed it without noticing, mistaking its gentle outline for another fold of sand. The desert around it had no name that survived. Ancient maps sometimes marked it with a faint curve of ink, but most left the space empty, as though silence itself was the best description. The library did not belong to any known empire or kingdom. It simply rested there waiting as if the earth had built it from memory. The earliest mentions speak of wandering scholars who carried bundles of papyrus across endless sands. They followed the stars at night, using the cool blue light to guide them toward a place where old writings could rest undisturbed. They reached the library by dawn, placing their scrolls on shelves made from tamarisk wood, soft and pale from centuries of sun. Inside, the air was always cooler than the desert outside. Not cold, just quietly preserved as though the walls exhaled every few moments. The light filtered in through narrow slits near the roof, creating calm, silver lines across the floor. Dust floated slowly in the stillness, drifting like small thoughts that had forgotten their direction. The shelves were uneven and old, but strong. They held writings from travelers nobody remembered, fragments of herbal lists, half-faded travel notes, small records of forgotten villages, and long, gentle descriptions of landscapes that may or may not exist anymore. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, only soft details of human life unfolding quietly across time. Scholars who visited the library rarely spoke, not because speech was forbidden, but because the place encouraged silence naturally. Even footsteps softened as they crossed the clay floor, as if the ground itself preferred quiet. Some scrolls were written on reed fibers, some on thin bark, others on leather stretched smooth and pale. Their edges curled inward from age, forming gentle arcs like the shape of a resting hand. The handwriting on them varied, some steady and neat, others loose and wandering. None of the writers seemed in a hurry. A long corridor extended toward the back of the library, ending in a single chamber that held the oldest texts. Nobody knew who built the chamber. Its walls were darkened by time, coated in layers of fine sand, carried by winds that passed gently through cracks. In the center lay a table of stone, worn smooth by centuries of scrolls resting upon it. Travelers who reached this chamber often described feeling as though the desert outside had paused. Time did not stop, but it stretched, lengthening each moment the way shadows stretch before sunset. Breathing felt slower, thoughts softened, the mind unwound naturally, without effort. Historians who later tried to study the library found themselves writing unusually slow notes, their pens moving at a calm, steady pace. They wrote about the faint smell of old fibers, the coolness of the walls, and the soft echo of sand shifting outside. Some noted the sound of wind brushing across the roof, a faint, steady whisper that seemed to continue even during the quietest hours. Others described how the sunlight entering the narrow slits shifted gradually across the floor, almost too slow to notice, but comforting in its softness. Even now, if you imagine standing in that library, the air feels still. The pages of old scrolls lie gently curled, resting after centuries of quiet. Dust moves like drifting thoughts, settling and rising without sound. The world beyond the walls fades into a soft blur of sand and distance. And somewhere in that slow, sunlit silence, a sense of ancient calm takes shape, the kind that settles into your breathing, into your thoughts, into the deep rhythm that slowly leads toward rest. Toward the eastern side of the library, the shelves stood closer together, forming long, narrow paths that encouraged slow steps. Each shelf leaned slightly, as if time had nudged it gently into comfort. The wood carried a faint ripple in its grain, softened by heat and age, giving the impression that the shelves themselves were resting. Scrolls were arranged in no particular order. Some lay neatly, others rested at an angle, their ends touching lightly as though they leaned on one another for balance. The colors had faded over centuries. Pale browns, soft ochres, muted grays. Nothing bright remained here. Every shade had settled into a calm, quiet tone. When early travelers placed new scrolls on these shelves, they often brushed sand from their clothing before setting them down. The sand never disappeared completely. It gathered in gentle patches along the floor, forming thin lines that followed the curves of the walls. These lines shifted a little each season, moved by breezes that slipped in under the old wooden door. Some scrolls held short records of small happenings, lists of items traded in modest markets, notes about weather patterns, descriptions of distant hills, or simple recipes that might have been common in forgotten villages. Writers rarely mentioned themselves. They focused on the ordinary, recording each detail with a quiet patience that matched the library's own stillness. One scroll described a long journey across dry plains, noting the shape of rocks that appeared in the distance every morning, and the faint glow they carried at sunrise. Another mentioned a traveler resting near a quiet river, describing how the water moved in slow, wide circles as if unsure of its direction. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just the pace of life unfolding gently. There were also records of small local customs, how villagers tied knots in woven reeds to mark the beginning of a season, or how fishermen placed small stones along the shore to track the movement of tides. These practices may never have been known beyond the few who wrote about them, yet they rested here with the same calm dignity as any grand tale. Farther along the shelves lay fragments of plant notes, naming herbs by descriptions rather than formal titles. One writer mentioned a shrub with thin leaves that curled inward during cold nights. Another described a root used for calming stomach aches, its texture rough but its scent mild. These details painted quiet images of landscapes that may no longer exist. Fields of wild plants growing in patterns shaped only by the wind. Sometimes readers who visited the library paused not to read but simply to stand among the shelves. The silence held them gently, the way soft fabric folds around the shape of what it covers. The air carried a faint scent of old wood and dried fibers, a smell that drifted slowly, unchanged for generations. When afternoon light reached the eastern wall, it entered through a small crack near the ceiling. It touched the edges of certain scrolls with a pale golden glow, so faint that it often went unnoticed. Those who did see it felt a sense of stillness spreading through them, as if the light itself moved in long, quiet breaths. The walls in this section had developed soft patterns over time, thin layers of dust that formed gentle waves, like the memory of water on stone. No one cleaned them away. They belonged to the place, a natural part of its slow, unhurried character. Sometimes a small insect would drift through the silent air, moving lazily before settling on a curled page. Its presence felt unintentional, yet completely fitting for the calm of the library. It moved with the same rhythm that guided everything in this place. Slow, easy, without resistance. If you imagine yourself walking down one of these narrow paths, your footsteps soften almost on their own. The air cools around you. The shadows stretch quietly along the ground. Every detail in the shelves invites your thoughts to settle, to rest the way the scrolls rest gently without weight. And in that unbroken stillness, the library feels not like a structure, but like a quiet memory of the world, one that unfolds softly, patiently, leading you deeper into calm, deeper into the slow rhythm of sleep. At the far end of the library, beyond the leaning shelves and the soft dust patterns that traced the floor, there was a narrow doorway leading into a deeper chamber. The frame of the doorway was made from a single piece of wood, darkened by time, worn smooth at the corners. Its grain softened into long, shallow curves. The door itself had long since disappeared, leaving nothing but space where it once rested. Inside the chamber, the air grew cooler, touched by the faint breath of earth beneath. The light entered only in slender lines, creating gentle shapes across the floor. Shapes that shifted so slowly they seemed almost still. Dust floated in the narrow beams of light, moving with the unhurried calm of drifting thoughts. The chamber held the oldest writings, those whose ink had faded into soft hues of brown and gray. Some scrolls lay open on low tables, their edges curled like dried petals. Others rested in shallow alcoves built into the clay walls, protected from the harsher winds that sometimes passed through the main hall. The ink on these ancient pages did not tell grand histories or mighty tales. It described small observations, the way morning light softened the edges of distant hills, or how certain stones warmed quickly under midday sun. One text quietly recorded the slow growth of a single tree over many seasons, noting the length of its shadow and the shape of its leaves. The writing was so gentle it almost blended into the page itself. In one corner of the chamber, a long table of stone stood in a pool of dim light. Its surface had been worn by countless scrolls resting upon it. The stone felt cool to the touch, even after centuries of desert warmth. Visitors who placed their hands on it often paused, feeling a sense of stillness settle into their palms, spreading slowly through their arms like a soft weight, encouraging rest. Some scrolls here were nearly unreadable. The ink had faded into faint, whisper-like lines as though the writer had been attempting to record a thought that was already drifting away. One described the shape of clouds on calm afternoons, noting how their edges softened as they approached the horizon. Another mentioned the patterns made by wind on sand, comparing them to the folds of woven cloth laid out under the sun. Along the back wall, shallow shelves held fragments of texts whose stories had been forgotten completely. Pieces of bark with light etchings, small strips of papyrus with a few lingering symbols, tiny notes on leather that had curled tightly with age. Each fragment carried only a few words, but those words seemed to rest peacefully, content with their incompleteness. Scholars who entered this chamber often found themselves slowing their movements without intending to. Their footsteps quieted, their breathing deepened. The walls absorbed sound gently, creating a muted atmosphere where even the softest rustle faded quickly. It felt as though the chamber preferred calm above all else. The ceiling in the chamber curved gently, shaped long ago by careful hands. Fine cracks ran across it in delicate lines, like veins in polished stone. Each crack had gathered a thin ribbon of sand over the years, creating patterns that resembled old maps of forgotten coastlines. They did not change quickly, Seasons passed before they shifted even slightly. Near the entrance, a single scroll stood upright in a clay vessel. Its outer layers were pale from sun exposure, but the inner pages remained surprisingly intact. When unrolled, it revealed a slow, careful description of stars, not as a guide for travel, but as quiet lights that kept watch over still nights. The writer spoke of how the stars seemed to pulse softly, as though breathing in rhythm with the earth. In the stillness of the chamber, you can almost imagine that faint pulsing, the slow rhythm of time itself, unhurried and gentle. Every object seems to breathe lightly, settling into place with the ease of something that has rested for centuries. If you picture yourself here, the cool air soothes the mind. The dim light relaxes the eyes. The faded ink invites no urgency, no tension, only stillness. Only the calm presence of history resting quietly, waiting for nothing. In this ancient, silent chamber, the world feels slower, softer, and infinitely patient, guiding you deeper, gently, into rest. Beyond the chamber of faded ink, a wide passage extended into a hall shaped by many generations of quiet visitors. The stone beneath the feet was smooth, not from any rush of movement, but from the soft, steady touch of countless footsteps taken at an unhurried pace. Each step that had ever crossed this floor seemed to linger in memory, leaving behind a faint impression of presence rather than sound. The walls of the hall were lined with tall pillars, carved from pale stone that had softened into muted tones over centuries. The edges of each pillar were rounded, worn by time into shapes that resembled calm waves. Faint patterns of dust gathered in the grooves, settling in the same gentle rhythm that guided everything within the library. Between the pillars hung narrow banners, woven long ago from simple fibers. Their colors had faded into soft earth tones, sandy beiges, muted browns, quiet grays. The fabric stirred slightly whenever a slender breeze drifted through the hall, moving so slowly that one could almost believe time itself had paused to watch. Along the sides of the hall, shallow niches held small artifacts that belonged to no specific era. A simple cup carved from stone, its surface uneven but familiar. A wooden tablet with a few shallow marks, perhaps unfinished or abandoned long ago. Smooth pebbles arranged in quiet patterns whose meanings had been lost. None of the objects demanded attention. They simply rested, content in their stillness. At the center of the hall stood a circular platform of polished stone. Its surface bore faint rings, each one formed by years of gentle contact. Scrolls placed down softly, hands resting for a moment, travelers pausing to breathe. The rings overlapped like ripples spreading slowly across water, frozen in time yet somehow continuing their silent motion. On the far side of the hall, a long row of narrow windows let in light that softened into misty patterns on the stone floor. The glass in the windows was old, uneven, carrying small bubbles and gentle distortions that made the outside world appear blurred. Trees beyond the wall swayed in the wind, but from inside they seemed to move in slow, dreamlike motions, as though nature were breathing in long, measured sighs. Visitors often walked through this hall without speaking. The air itself encouraged silence, not the heavy kind, but the calm, open quiet that invites the mind to drift. Even a single whisper seemed to dissolve before it reached the pillars. Footsteps faded almost as soon as they touched the floor. Some scrolls in the hall rested on low stands, their pages unrolled just enough to reveal simple diagrams. One depicted lines tracing the path of an old stone road. Another showed the outline of a mountain whose summit had long ago lost its sharp edge to time. These drawings lacked urgency. They felt more like someone observing the world with gentle curiosity. One stand held a map composed of soft, faint strokes. It did not identify kingdoms or boundaries. It showed only the natural shapes of land, curves of hills, flows of rivers, small marks that might have been villages or simply memories of them. The map's edges were frayed, its corners folded over as though it had been carried slowly across many quiet miles. In a shadowed corner, a set of steps led upward. Each step was shallow and wide, shaped to encourage slow movement. No carvings adorned them. No marks indicated a purpose. They simply rose into a narrow space lit by soft, indirect light. Every traveler who climbed them did so without haste, breathing in the gentleness of the hall as they ascended. The silence in the hall of quiet footsteps carried a warmth that did not come from heat, but from age. It felt like the presence of all those who had passed through before, scholars, wanderers, caretakers, each leaving behind a faint trace of thoughtfulness like invisible footprints layered softly upon one another. And as the light continued to drift through the windows, shifting slowly across the stone, the hall seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. A rhythm that encouraged deeper calm, deeper stillness, guiding the mind to settle as gently as dust upon ancient stone. Here nothing rushed, nothing demanded, everything simply waited, quiet, patient, and soft, inviting you to sink more deeply into rest. Beyond the hall, the path narrowed again, leading toward a long chamber where sound behaved differently. This place was known to old caretakers as the archive of gentle echoes, not because it was loud, but because every sound that entered it seemed to soften immediately, folding itself into the air like a whisper settling into cloth. The entrance was a simple arch of clay-coated stone. Along its sides, faint impressions of fingers remained, perhaps left by those who shaped the arch centuries ago. The marks were shallow and uneven, yet unmistakably human. They reminded visitors that every quiet place begins with quiet hands. Inside, the chamber stretched farther than it first appeared. The ceiling curved into smooth arcs, as though fashioned by water rather than tools. Light entered through small circular openings high above, descending in soft columns that spread like pale mist across the floor. Dust drifted through the beams, turning slowly, catching the faintest glimmer before fading back into the still air. Low shelves lined the chamber, filled not with scrolls but with small wooden boxes. Each box carried a symbol on its lid, a line, a curve, a tiny circle. Their meanings had been forgotten long before any recent caretaker arrived, yet no one attempted to interpret them. The boxes were left untouched, respected in their silence. Some visitors believed the boxes contained sounds captured from distant regions. The soft roll of desert wind, the distant call of a bird, the quiet trickle of a hidden spring. Others thought they held fragments of memories, moments too gentle to write down, preserved only in the quiet of each sealed container. No one ever opened them to confirm. Their mystery was part of the peace they offered. A narrow path wound between the shelves, guiding footsteps with subtle turns. At certain points, the floor dipped slightly, forming shallow basins where cool air collected in still layers. When someone stepped through them, the temperature shifted softly against their skin, like a slow breath passing over the room. In the center of the archive stood a wide, round table carved from a single slab of smooth limestone. Its surface was pale and unmarked except for a shallow indentation shaped like a bowl. Over countless years, people had placed small objects there. A dried leaf, a polished pebble, a scrap of woven cloth. Signs not of wealth or importance, but of presence. Simple tokens acknowledging the calm of the place. Sometimes the faintest sounds drifted through the chamber, not true echoes, but soft impressions of noises that seemed to exist only half-formed. The suggestion of old footsteps, the memory of distant voices, the nearly silent rustle of fabric. These gentle sounds came and went without pattern, arriving like calm thoughts and disappearing just as quietly. On the far wall, a long strip of plaster bore a line of tiny carvings. They were simple marks, no longer sharp, worn down by age and perhaps touch. Some marks curved like flowing water. Others resembled the outline of hills. No one knew whether they were a story or simply decoration. Their presence felt like a quiet conversation with time, soft, incomplete, and peaceful. Travelers who reached this archive often lingered without realizing how long they stayed. The chamber's hush settled around them, easing the mind, slowing the breath. Even those who arrived with questions found themselves setting those questions down, letting them fade into the gentle quiet that filled the space. The light within the archive changed slowly throughout the day. Morning light entered in narrow beams, touching only the tops of shelves. By afternoon, the beams widened, casting pale, elongated shapes across the floor, and at dusk, the chamber dimmed into a soft, uniform gray as though wrapped in a single calming veil. Standing here, one could almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down, not heavy but comforting, like a blanket that has warmed under the sun. Every surface carried a softness that encouraged stillness. Every corner held a calm deeper than silence. And in that calm, time seemed to stretch smooth and unbroken, guiding thoughts into gentle drift, guiding the mind toward rest. At the farthest end of the archive, past the shelves of quiet boxes and the drifting beams of pale light, lay a final doorless passage. It opened into a large, rounded chamber, the oldest and most sheltered place within the entire library. Caretakers called it the Sanctuary of Resting Pages, though no one recalls when that name first began. The air here felt different from every room before it. It carried a faint coolness, touched by the deep earth beneath the foundation. The quiet was even softer, as though the chamber absorbed sound before it fully formed, leaving only a gentle hum of stillness that settled against the skin like a calm breath. The walls were curved and smooth, shaped over many generations by hands that had moved with patience. Time had left subtle traces, thin cracks that grew slowly, patterns of dust that drifted into ripples, faint discolorations where old moisture once lingered. These changes did not disturb the space. They gave it a sense of age that felt protective rather than worn. In the center of the sanctuary rested a single long table made from pale wood, its surface almost white with age. It held only a few open pages, fragments of texts too fragile to move. The writing on them had faded into soft shadows of ink, barely visible, like distant memories. Some words appeared only when viewed from a certain angle, catching the faint glow of the overhead light. These pages contained simple records, the shape of clouds on slow afternoons, the direction of wind across flat plains, the quiet habits of small animals that lived near forgotten settlements. One page listed the phases of the moon during a particularly mild season, noting how its light softened the edges of stones in the courtyard. Another described the steady rhythm of rainfall during a year of calm weather. The sanctuary held no sharp smells, no strong colors, no interruptions. Everything had settled into muted tones, pale browns, soft grays, faint ivories. Even the light seemed to move gently, gathering in loose pools across the floor and drifting slowly with the passing hours. Along the curved walls were shallow alcoves containing bundles of pages wrapped in thin cloth. The cloth had thinned over time, becoming almost translucent. Through it, one could see glimpses of faint lines and shapes, sketches of rivers, outlines of early tools, notes about seasonal cycles. None of the pages were bound. They rested freely, exactly as they had been left. Above the chamber, Small circular openings allowed thin ribbons of daylight to descend. The light entered so softly that it seemed to hesitate before touching the floor. Dust floated through it in slow spirals, each mote drifting with a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. A low stone bench followed the curve of the wall. Anyone who sat upon it found their posture easing, their thoughts slowing. Something in the air encouraged stillness, the kind that rises gently through the body, loosening the grip of the day. Some travelers fell asleep here without meaning to, resting while the sanctuary watched over them with its quiet warmth. Across from the entrance stood a small alcove that held a single object, an old rounded vessel made of clay, its surface cracked into delicate patterns. No one knew its purpose. Some believed it once held ink, others thought it stored water gathered from early rains. Over time, it had become simply a symbol of the sanctuary itself, a reminder that even the smallest objects can hold centuries of calm. The floor of the chamber bore faint markings shaped by soft movement over generations. They formed long, sweeping arcs that curved gently toward the center, as if guiding footsteps into the heart of the room. These marks were subtle, barely visible, yet they gave the sense of a path shaped by time rather than design. Toward evening, the sanctuary grew cooler. The light dimmed, settling into a gray-blue tone that made the pages on the table appear to glow faintly. In this quiet, one could almost hear the soft breath of the library around them, a calm, steady presence that asked for nothing and offered only peace. Every surface felt patient. Every corner carried its own small hush. Here history did not rise or proclaim. It rested. It settled like dust on a sleeping world. It whispered to no one and waited for nothing. And in that deep, unbroken stillness, the sanctuary guided the mind into the same gentle rest. Soft, slow, steady, like pages finally settling after a long, quiet day. The library held its breath, and the world drifted calmly into silence.